History as it happens, November 29th, 2022. One-term presidents.
Our party can truly feel that we have held the faith. That we shall do so in the future is our solemn responsibility of this hour.
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
I've seen the strength of my nation, and I've seen the crises that it approached in a tentative way. And I've had to deal with those crises as best I could.
Maybe I won't get it wrong. Are you suggesting that if somebody has means, that the national debt doesn't affect them?
I am asking for your vote. I am asking for your support. And I am asking for your friendship and your prayers. This very incredible but dangerous journey.
Donald Trump is trying to do something only one-term president has done before: win a non-consecutive term after being rejected by voters. Joe Biden says he expects to run for a second term. It's also been quite a while since an incumbent president voluntarily stepped away. American history doesn't offer too many guides to help us understand our crazy politics today, but we're going to try anyway, next with Jeffrey Engel, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
My judgment of running when I announce, if I announce, my intention is that I run again.
Most Republicans, who of course say that they will vote for Trump and back Trump, also say, and as the polling goes, they'd rather have somebody else with the same policies, that they are done with him and his erratic nature personally. They'd rather have a DeSantis. They'd rather have an Abbott. So if Trump wins the nomination, I think it's almost impossible to conceive of him actually winning re-election. And I'll give you a good example of a person who tried to run with negatives over 50%, and that was Hillary Clinton.
All right, let's see how closely you paid attention in high school history class. Name the presidents who lost their bid for a second term. I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about it. John Adams, his son John Quincy Adams, Martin Van Buren, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, William Taft, Herbert Hoover, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, and Donald Trump. Now, only two of those tried to win a non-consecutive term after losing the first time, Van Buren and Cleveland, and only Cleveland was successful. He defeated the man who had beaten him 4 years before, Benjamin Harrison. And now we have Donald Trump giving it a try.
If our movement remains united and confident, then we will shatter the forces of tyranny and we will unleash the glories of liberty for ourselves and for our children and for generations yet to come. America's golden age is just ahead.
Well, as I speak into this microphone in late 2022, it's not clear Trump will even win his party's nomination. Also unclear is whether Joe Biden will seek a second term. In his news conference after the midterm elections, he left open the door to stepping aside.
My judgment of running when I announce, if I announce, my intention is that I run again. But I'm a great respecter of fate, and this is ultimately a family decision. I think everybody wants me to run, but we're going to have discussions about it. And I don't feel in any hurry one way or another to make that judgment, today, tomorrow, or whenever, no matter what my predecessor does.
So about the list of 10, it does sound incomplete, right? Well, at the top of the podcast, you heard the montage of former presidents. The first voice was Herbert Hoover from his very last public speech as president. And Hoover would continue to criticize the New Deal during the 1930s after his landslide defeat, and he is on our list. The second voice, Gerald Ford. He did lose the '76 election after one term, or really half a term. But Ford was not elected to the presidency or vice presidency. He took the oath of office after Nixon's resignation.
Particularly at this time, with problems we face at home and abroad, to continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress.
And it was Ford's pardoning of Nixon that is said to have hurt his chances against Jimmy Carter, who, along with Hoover, epitomized the hapless, hard-luck chief executive.
We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation.
And as you know, Carter is on the list. He won one term, lost the second time. James K. Polk is not on the list. He promised to run for only one term and stuck to it after winning the election of 1844. John Tyler, who took office after William Henry Harrison died weeks after being sworn in, fell out of favor with the two main parties and then briefly ran as a third-party candidate before dropping out. But similar to Ford, Tyler was not elected president to begin with. And what about LBJ?
I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Johnson finished Kennedy's first term, then won in a landslide in 64, but then he bowed out in 68 because he had become so unpopular from his handling of Vietnam. Yes, things can change quickly in politics, as George H.W. Bush would have told you. His approval rating soared to 90% after the first Gulf War in 1991. But by the time he was debating Clinton and Perot in late 92, he seemed out of touch.
We have a question right here.
Yes, how has the national debt personally affected each of your lives? And if it hasn't, how can you honestly find a cure for the economic problems of the common people if you have no experience in what's ailing them?
Well, I think the national debt affects everybody. Obviously, it has a lot to do with interest rates. It has.
She's saying you personally.
On a personal basis, how has it affected you?
Has it affected you personally?
Well, I'm sure it has. I love my grandchildren. I want to think that they're going to be able to afford an education. I think that that's an important part of being a parent. Maybe I won't get it wrong. Are you suggesting that if somebody has means, that the national debt doesn't affect them?
So whether we're talking about the list of 10 or some of these other figures who don't quite belong on it, it all shows how turbulent presidential politics have been and will probably continue to be in 2024, a situation historian Jeffrey Engel compares to 1912, when Teddy Roosevelt, running as a third-party candidate, tried to win a non-consecutive term, although TR hadn't lost a re-election bid, and that's why he's not on that initial list. Maybe he belongs in a category to himself, as does Jeffrey Engel, director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, and he is the author of When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War. Hello once more to Jeffrey Engel.
It is always so good to talk to you, Martin.
So should we get the Jets talk out of the way now, or should we wait for the end of the podcast? Maybe the end.
Last time we talked, I was expressing enthusiasm and they promptly lost, so I'm not saying anything optimistic anymore.
Well, and as listeners probably have figured out by now, I record my interviews days, maybe a week or so before the episode actually comes out. So by the time anyone hears this, the Jets will have already played the Patriots.
It will actually be history.
That's right. It will be history. Hopefully good history for a franchise that has a terrible history. I just don't know that many Jets fans here in Washington. And you're down in Texas. I don't even know how that works. So maybe I should start by grilling you off the top of your head to rattle off the names in order of every single one-term president. I'm not going to do that. But, compiling this list, Jeffrey, is difficult because some people are one-term presidents who didn't run for re-election, didn't want to run for re-election. LBJ wasn't a one-term president, right, because he filled the last part of JFK's term, but then he doesn't run for re-election in 68. I don't know. Help me out here.
Well, I mean, it reinforces the point that when we're talking about the presidents, we're still dealing with a dramatically small sample size. We're only talking about 46 and 45 people, obviously, and differences between the way the world was structured politically, technologically, in terms of how the president engaged with the public, president engaged with the Congress, completely different from the 18th century to the 19th century to the 20th. So I think that we can come up with useful examples that are illustrative of how we might think about today. But I don't think we have a big enough sample size. Even if I trusted sample sizes, we wouldn't have a big enough one to draw any definitive conclusions based upon one-term questions.
Well, the Constitution is vague, right, about the roles of the president. George Washington essentially creates them. Everything he does sets a precedent. The president winds up, well, today we have an imperial presidency, but it wasn't clear right at the start just how strong the president would be or how long the president should stay in office. I mean, the terms were 4 years apiece. Hamilton wanted a lifetime president, right? He wanted almost like a quasi-king. But then Washington sets the precedent for presidents of 2 terms, and it basically stays that way until 32, 36, 1940 is when FDR breaks that pattern.
Yeah, that's the first time that someone actually wins a third term.
Yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this monologue here. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is, for a while there, I mean, one term was kind of the norm in the 19th century. There were very few 2-termers.
In the late 19th, sure. And the fact that Washington sets the precedent is important and also really useful, because we have to remember that the presidency, even in Washington's day, was a particularly exhausting job. I would argue actually gotten even more and more difficult. Our mutual colleague, Jeremy Surrey, has argued lately that the presidency is actually an impossible job. So the strain it puts on one individual is dramatic. So it's rather useful, I think, for most presidents, again, small sample size, most presidents to be able to say, well, it's a good thing I don't have to try to think about whether I want to violate Washington's precedent. Of course, now, after FDR, there's a constitutional constraint on how long presidents can be in office. It's actually 10 years or 2 elections, presuming that you get into finishing somebody. If you're a vice president, let's say, and you finish someone else's election, you can still run 2 more times unless it's going to be 10 years in total. So people like Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, they knew from the moment that they started their second term that they were not doing it again. Every president, I think, except for FDR, has found it really useful to be able to say, boy, this job is exhausting. I don't want a third term. And, I shouldn't take one because it wasn't good enough for Washington. It's not good enough for me.
After Andrew Jackson won 2 terms, there wasn't another 2-term winner until Lincoln. Of course, he's assassinated. And then after Lincoln, it took quite a while for another 2-termer. No, I'm sorry, Grant. Then after Grant, it took a while for another 2-termer. And what does that say about American politics during that period, that it was difficult for a president to win a second term?
I think it actually tells us that there are periods in American history where not so much politics, but the Electoral College are more structurally stable than others. So in the late 19th century, we have a lot of active competition between different parties, Democrats and Republicans primarily, obviously, that are competitive across the nation. And therefore, we get a lot of flip-flopping among parties. One might actually anticipate that you might see that in coming years in our own politics. Whereas by 1896, William McKinley, of course, establishes a steady electoral college system that I argue should not have been broken until something unbelievably dramatic occurred, something like, ultimately, the Great Depression. It took something of that magnitude to break the lock the Republicans had, not on Congress, but on the presidency because of the Electoral College, the way we elect the president.
And you're saying that started with McKinley.
So from 1896 to 1932, I argue there's no reason whatsoever that we should ever expect a Democrat to win, except, of course, for 1912, which I know we're going to talk about, which is a funky election. And it takes funkiness for them to win. And my point being, we shouldn't be surprised that we see repeat elected presidents during a period of great political stability for one party.
Yeah, so about 1912, that year did not pop into my mind when I started preparing for this conversation. We're going to get to that and why it's relevant, in your view, for what we might expect now with Biden, the incumbent, and Donald Trump running again, trying to become the first president since Grover Cleveland to win non-consecutive terms. So just for the benefit of listeners, there were 9 other presidents in addition to Grover Cleveland who were ousted after 1 term. And of those 9, only 1 ever ran again, Martin Van Buren. He lost the Democratic nomination in 1844. So Trump would be the 3rd then. Bush, George H.W. Bush, Carter, Ford, Hoover, Taft, Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland, as mentioned, Van Buren, Quincy Adams, and John Adams was the first one-termer. But James K. Polk, eventually getting to my point here, I wanted to talk about Polk. James K. Polk only wanted to serve one term, and he made it clear from the start. Wasn't it in his inaugural address? He said, here are my goals.
This is a promise for Polk. He has very clear goals. Honestly, the best way to understand Polk, I think, is to focus on what really mattered to him most of all, which was expanding the country out to the Pacific. He said, I'm going to dedicate all of my energy to this, and after 4 years, I'm leaving. Whether you approve or disapprove, one must give Polk credit for being able to complete his goals. He launches the Mexican-American War. By the time he leaves, California is coming into the Union, so is new territories in Mexico, from Mexico, and he departs an incredibly depleted man. He dies only a few months later.
I didn't know that.
He literally worked himself to death. Many presidents are workaholics. Some are not. Polk, even by the standards of his own day, basically burned through secretaries and burned through assistants because nobody would keep up with the 14, 16, 18-hour days he put in every single day.
Wow.
And people around him, his wife especially, throughout his presidency, tried to pull him back from the abyss and say, you look terrible, you sound terrible, you feel terrible, you're losing weight, you're sick all the time. This is not sustainable. And his argument was, I'm not trying to sustain it. I'm trying to give everything I have to my 4 years and then go home.
One and done. Well, this was manifest destiny imperialism, really. I mean, the war in Mexico is a war of aggression.
Exactly. But, taking a step back, I think we shouldn't be so surprised that presidents who lose seeking re-election don't often come back for another bite at the apple. And one of the ways to understand that is that presidents are, of course, among other things, heads of their political parties. And a party is, as with any pyramid, built up of a lot of people below the pinnacle who want to move up the ranks. So it's not simply that we have presidents who exhaust themselves and don't want to run again after losing after a first term. It's that there are other people climbing up behind them and pulling them down. Typically, I think this is honestly what makes Donald Trump so fascinating at this point, that he, I think, completely understands that in order to stay atop the pinnacle of Republican politics, he has to push down people who might want to climb up. He has to knock down the DeSantises and the Abbotts and others, because nobody goes into politics without an ego. And there are many people in the political stream who want to be president. And once somebody's had a bite at the apple, they think, why should you have a second?
And I just now remembered what I wanted to say when we were discussing there about what can we infer about our politics when we go through a period of a lot of one-term presidents. Recently, we've been in an era of two-term presidents, for the most part. Reagan, some say then Bush was like Reagan's third term, but Bush was a one-term president. Clinton, 2 terms, Obama, 2 terms. But when Reagan comes to office, we went through a period, if not strictly speaking one-term presidents, where the presidency was in upheaval. JFK assassinated.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
Lyndon Johnson decides not to run for re-election in 1968.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Then we have, Nixon.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Jimmy Carter, 1 miserable term.
It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will.
I guess my question finally, I'm very verbose today. Sorry, Jeff. I mean, when Reagan comes to office, was there a sense the presidency was actually broken?
Well, there's a sense the country was broken, in large part after Watergate. Remember that Americans' faith in their institutions, all institutions, but government in particular, drop after Watergate and have never regained that level. The trust that Americans have within the system, if you will, has broken. But I actually think I have a different perspective on this. And if you take a step back, I think that the post-1932 period for American history, and in particular, the entire Cold War, is actually a period of remarkably stable politics. We sometimes refer to this as a period of consensus politics. So yes, we have presidents who are mostly serving 2 terms, winning re-election. Obviously, Truman, not a full second term, but we get the point, wins the second term. Eisenhower. Kennedy, obviously, we won't know, but we do know that the Democrat won the next ensuing election. So
by
my point
a massive landslide, too.
Yeah. So what you're basically getting is not the flip-flopping of the 19th century where it's 1 term, 1 term, 1 term, 1 term. You're getting 2 terms, and sometimes you're getting 3 terms. From Reagan to H.W. Bush is 3 terms. And there is a sense, I think, in which that shows the stability of the office until we get to a breaking point, and that breaking point is Watergate.
Yeah.
Obviously, absent Watergate, we would have had another Nixon finishing his second term. And I can't tell you what would have happened after that, but I do know that Ford loses in large measure because of a hangover from Watergate.
That's right.
Carter wins because of a hangover from Watergate.
It makes a person like Carter possible, right? An outsider.
Yeah.
Right.
By the way, I think if you were to rank which presidents got the worst hand dealt to them when they entered office, obviously Lincoln wins. But close behind, after a big gap, close behind is Jimmy Carter. I'm not sure there's any president who could have been successful given the things that happened to Jimmy Carter. And then immediately we jump back to another 3 terms of Republican rule. So I think actually stability is what we're seeing in the American presidency. And that was, again, one of the things that makes Donald Trump's defeat in 2020 so unusual. We don't actually see that many since 1945 first-term presidents lose.
And incumbents have an advantage. So you're saying stability and tumult coexisted. It is fascinating to think what would have happened to the Reagan Revolution, which is in part a reaction to not just Carter, but the dismal state of affairs in the country in the late 1970s. As far as taking over under troubled times, Lincoln, FDR, but yeah, Carter had it rough. 1979 was that a difficult year for anyone.
It was, and remember
timing is important too. Reagan tried to win the presidency in 76. Lucky for him, he didn't.
Well, exactly. And also, remember that the polling data suggests that the election of 1980, though, if you look just at the final map, at the snapshot map of how it turned out, it was not that close. The polling says it was very close up until the last 10 days or so. So it was not expected to be a blowout. Just the clock ran out on Carter. On the other hand, there are some political scientists that argue that if the election had been a week later, Carter would have been able to come back and at least make it closer. And so I think that the specific timing of these things matter. And also, this, I think, is a worthwhile moment to take a step back and just remember that the Electoral College votes are, like all elections, a snapshot. They tell us about that particular moment. And sometimes we need to remember the context of that moment. Great example is Reagan, not in 80, but in 84. Reagan, of course, wins a massive landslide in 84. Walter Mondale only carries Washington, D.C. and his home state of Minnesota, escaping embarrassment in that way. But for exit polls of people who voted for Reagan in 1984, 2/3 said if you had to give him a letter grade, they would give him a C- or lower. So
his first term did not go well for the most part until the very end of it.
Things that he was able to capitalize on the Morning in America enthusiasm in 1984, obviously, to say things had turned.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes.
But if you just looked at the snapshot and say, look, massive landslide 80, massive landslide 84, you'd think this guy's popular the entire time. The truth is he was very unpopular, Reagan, at different times. He just happened to be more popular than Mondale and more popular than Carter.
And from what I understand, from what I've read, the vote for Reagan was, well, he did, of course, have his base of supporters. Every president or candidate does. But it was more so, dissatisfaction with Carter and the course of the country than for Reagan, because Reagan's 1980 campaign was somewhat of a fumbling campaign.
And he was considered a radical in many ways, just as in 1964, Barry Goldwater was considered beyond the bounds of normal political discussion with his conservatism. Reagan, too. By 1980, there was concerns that he was not within the normal parameters, that he was too hawkish, that he was dangerous, he was a warmonger. And that's one of the reasons why in the 1980 Republican convention, there's serious discussion. And when I say serious discussion, I need to underline that 3 times. Serious negotiations between Reagan and Ford. about whether or not maybe Ford should come back onto the ticket. That's never
right.
happened before.
I learned that from reading a book. I'm sorry to interrupt. William Inboden's new book called The Peacemaker. I did not know that the Reagan camp approached Ford about having him on the
and the
ticket.
reason and the reason is specific because Ford was, he lost the election, but people trusted Ford and saw Ford as a calming, experienced hand. Reagan did not give the impression in 1980 as being either experienced or calm. So if a presidential candidate oftentimes picks a vice presidential candidate to try to shore up their weakness, the weakness that Reagan's people saw in 1980 was that people were anxious about him. There's no reason to be anxious about Jerry Ford.
Yeah, that's right. Ford was a proponent of détente. Reagan was not. We covered it all. See you later. No. So, you wrote a piece in Time magazine about the 1912 election. As I said, I wasn't thinking of 1912 when I started preparing for this conversation. Not even sure what inspired me to contact you to talk about one-term presidents. Oh, this was it. That it's my prediction, and no one listens to this podcast for my predictions, that Joe Biden won't run for a second term. I think that he will in the spring announce he's going to be a one-term president. But also we're facing Donald Trump trying to win non-consecutive terms for only the second time in American history. So there's a lot of one-termishness here to talk about. So, all right, let me pose a question, though, instead of, like I said, I'm very verbose for some reason today.
Because we're good friends.
Yeah, 1912. What an election. Remind us why Teddy Roosevelt didn't run for president in 1908 when he could have, because he basically had served almost 2 full terms, but there was no limitation at that time. So why doesn't he run for president in 08?
Yeah, so remember, Roosevelt comes in as the young person on the ticket in 1900 with William McKinley, who himself was running for re-election. So Roosevelt was a replacement vice president. And McKinley is soon after shot by an anarchist, actually dies in Buffalo, which I like to point out is redundant. And as a Jets fan. And consequently, Roosevelt is in charge for 7 years. And there is no constitutional bar against him running. And I should mention, Roosevelt was the youngest president in all of U.S. history. So you have a young, vibrant, energetic guy who has still decades ahead of him in politics as far as he's concerned. And there is a big question as to whether he should follow the spirit of George Washington and say that you should not seek a third term, presuming that he had been on the ballot in Roosevelt's first term, or whether he should break precedent. And he decides he's going to step back. The decision, frankly, I think he regretted almost immediately. He decides he's going to step back and hand things over to not only his handpicked successor, but one of his closest personal friends, who is William Howard Taft, who was, among other things at that point, Secretary of War. And Roosevelt anoints Taft, and Taft promises to follow Roosevelt's progressive policies. Roosevelt, I think you can argue, with every year of his presidency, got a little bit more progressive, a little bit more radical, a little bit more concerned about the stability of capitalism. Taft promised he would continue on that track. Roosevelt leaves office in 1908 and leaves the country, goes to Africa, actually goes to do a world tour, goes to Europe. He's actually there, by the way, in London when the King of England dies, and is offered a place in the parade of national leaders, kings and queens, representing the United States, which is the first time an American president had that opportunity, an ex-president in this case. And it's really a moment you can look to America coming out on the world stage, if you will.
Oh, so he wasn't offered to be the next king. I'm kidding. Oh, go ahead.
He would have accepted, let's put it that way. But Roosevelt had a fundamental flaw, I think. And I should bracket all this conversation by saying, when I'm asked to pick who are the greatest presidents in American history, that's a different question than who are my favorite presidents in American history. Roosevelt happens to be my favorite president in American history, which is I want to make that clear because I'm about to explain all the things that he did wrong. His fundamental flaw was his ego. And as his daughter Alice said, he likes to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. If he is not the center of attention, he's not happy. And Roosevelt comes back to the United States and begins to quibble with Taft's policies, with Taft's decisions, essentially saying, I might have done the same thing, but I would have done it a different way. I have a different spirit. He's not being presidential enough. He's not being me, essentially, and ultimately decides that he will run for the 1912 Republican nomination against his handpicked successor and best friend, Taft, trying to get the Republican nomination.
So how was the nominating process done in those days? There weren't primaries like today. Teddy Roosevelt says that the process was rigged. Another echo for what we're seeing today, right? So how did Taft beat out Teddy Roosevelt for the 1912 GOP nomination?
Well, and here I think I'm going to give Roosevelt a little bit of credit. Roosevelt said the process is rigged. Trump says the process is rigged. Only one of these two men were actually right. And I think that's Roosevelt. Because at this time, there is not, as you mentioned, there's not 50 primaries plus District of Columbia and
no TV debates.
Territories. No. And instead, there are, before the campaign begins, there are 5 states that hold primaries. And the delegates are not selected 100% from the votes of those primaries within those states. The primary, if you will, selects half or a third in some cases of the delegates, and the party leadership within each state selects the other delegates. Roosevelt's people make a big push that there should be more popular engagement in the election process at the time. And keep in mind, there's also a movement at this time that senators should be elected by popular vote, not by legislatures as the Constitution mandates. So there's a general sense in this period that we need more popular voting. By the time that they are done campaigning, 14 states have decided they're going to have primaries. Again, none of them give 100% of the delegates to whoever wins the primary, all of which is to say Roosevelt wins not all, but most of the votes in the 14 primaries. But the delegates available from those 14 primaries were only a small margin of what was needed for the nomination. The bulk of the delegates were, in fact, selected by party elders.
So it's kind of like a super delegates analogy to what we see.
Exactly.
A little bit, yeah.
And there are shenanigans that go on. For example,
the party wants somebody and not the other person. That would happen.
Well, and you know, there's a big fight at the Republican convention in 1912 over who is going to be the chair of the convention, because the chair of the convention is going to have a lot of power to determine who gets recognized as a legitimate delegate. And some of these, I got to tell you, some of these party conventions on the state level were beyond, with the exception of January 6th, beyond what we can fathom in our politics. You know, there's lots of stories of fistfights, police breaking up riots on the floor of these conventions. In one state, the person who is charged with reading the votes has a gun put to his head by someone from the other party just to make sure he read them the right way. Chaos by our comparison. But the net result is that Roosevelt believes if the people had had their voice, he would have won. But the delegates didn't count out that way. So Roosevelt breaks with the Republican Party. He tells his people, this is a revolution. The party has gone astray. They are not responding to the public voice. And I, with my ego, I am the representative the people really want.
So he starts a third party, right? The Bull Moose Party? Was
Exactly.
a reform party? Wow. You know, I can understand why Taft and his people would have been annoyed by all of this. Same reasons why somebody today would be annoyed. Coming down to an election, you want the party to be unified around one person, and this other fellow stepped away 4 years beforehand.
Well, and people were very clear about what the result of this was going to be. Remember, Republicans have that electoral college lock. If they can unite, they will win, period. The only way they lose is by splitting their vote. And Roosevelt, by breaking away from the party, was by definition going to split the vote. You know, I would argue that Roosevelt, if he had sat back and said, I want to be president again, but I'm not going to run against my best friend, and more importantly, I'm not going to split the party, he would have been the nominee in 1916, most likely. So he would have gotten back into the White House, just not immediately. But again, I have to stress, Roosevelt, who I like, was driven in many ways by a Roosevelt-centered universe.
He certainly wanted to be president during a war, although in 1912, we don't know that there's a war coming.
Yeah, I don't think that's part of the calculation, but he can't fathom anyone else being president. Yeah. There's a fourth person in this election as well. Eugene Debs, a socialist candidate, which, again, gives a very good sense of the fact that everyone in this election is trying to portray themselves as a change agent to some extent. Taft perhaps being the most limited change agent, but still a progressive, he calls himself, conservative progressive. Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic nominee, is a progressive. Theodore Roosevelt starts a progressive party. Debs, the socialist, really wants radical change. And Debs winds up winning 6% of the national vote, and you can really impress your friends at dinner with this factoid. That is the highest percentage of the vote that a socialist has ever gotten in American history.
Yeah, and there were quite a few that ran for president over the years. Norman Thomas ran a bunch of times. Debs ran a bunch of times. And that's pretty good for this wouldn't be a third-party candidate. It'd be a fourth
party. Yeah. Well, it just shows how much the country wanted change.
Well, sometimes it's hard to know when there's a split vote or a three-way race where those votes would have gone had that person not been involved. Say, Perot in 92, right? I think some people assume that Bush lost because of Perot. Well, I don't know if we can be 100% sure of that. It's possible. In this case, I think it's pretty clear. I mean, you had basically two Republicans. Yeah. So had Roosevelt lost the nomination to Taft and then quietly went away, maybe Taft would have beat Wilson, but he doesn't. So he forms his own party, the Bull Moose Party, which was basically him, right?
It collected disaffected progressives, people who thought that Taft wasn't moving far enough, people who wanted Wilson to move more. It drew away more Republicans than it did Democrats. I don't want to forget, on the 92 issue, I'm one of those people that actually thinks that Bill Clinton beats H.W. Bush straight up anyway. Yeah. And we can talk about that. Sure. But again, because the country wanted change after so many years. So Roosevelt splits the party. Roosevelt goes on the campaign trail. By the way, there is an incredible moment, which I think most Americans have forgotten in this campaign, which is that Roosevelt, while campaigning in Milwaukee, is shot by a would-be assassin.
I didn't know that.
Oh, it's incredible. He's walking out to give a speech. I think it was actually going to be at the state fairgrounds, gets into his car, and he's shot basically in the same way that William McKinley had been shot, by somebody coming up and getting 5 feet from the president. He doesn't die by luck because the bullet entered his jacket, hits his eyeglass case, and then gets slowed down even further by the 50 pages of the speech that he had written out that he was going to give.
Only a 50-page speech. Wow.
It was a short by Roosevelt standards.
Well, political oratory was a popular spectator sport in those days, but go ahead.
Yeah, so the bullet breaks his rib and breaks the skin, but is so slowed down it can't penetrate beyond his ribs. So the would-be assassin is arrested. Roosevelt actually gets in his face after he's handcuffed and screams at him and says, "Why would you do this? Why would you do this?" But then, as you can imagine, Roosevelt's advisors say, "You've been shot. We think you should go to the hospital." Roosevelt says, "No, I'm going to give my speech." Goes and gives his speech, and it's incredible. He stands up on the stage, opens his jacket to show the blood that is dripping down his shirt to say, "This is how much the establishment wants me out of the race. This is how dangerous we are as progressives to the change that they want to keep from happening. They have tried to silence me, but you cannot silence me. I'm as strong as a bull moose." Now, I argue, if he had walked off the stage at that point, people would have said that was the greatest speech in all of American history. Instead, he winds up talking for about 90 minutes more, with every minute diffusing and reducing the enthusiasm of his opening statement. "They have shot me." Well, if you can talk for 90 minutes afterwards, how bad can it be?
Good point. Although, having never been shot before, I can't tell you my ability.
I just think it would have been much more, if he had said, "You cannot kill me, and I'm going to go get a Band-Aid."
Gettysburg Address was one of the most brilliant pieces of oratory in American history. It was like 90 seconds or 2 minutes.
Exactly.
Whereas the other person who spoke that day did what people in those days did, talk forever. So the 1912 outcome, Woodrow Wilson, the first candidate to receive over 400 electoral votes. And when you just look at this in terms of electoral votes, it's misleading because it's Wilson 435, Roosevelt 88, Taft 8, and Debs 0. What split vote? I mean, you combine the electoral totals for Roosevelt and Taft, they don't even come close to Wilson. But here is the key. Yes, Wilson does carry 40 states with 6 million popular votes. If you total Roosevelt's 4 million and Taft's 3.4 million, they have close to 7.5 million votes, or 1.3 million more votes than the winner. What a crazy election.
Woodrow Wilson is, in my estimation, and I don't think I'm alone in this, not necessarily the best, not necessarily the worst, but clearly the most influential and important foreign policy president of perhaps all of American history, certainly of the 20th century on till today. Every president that comes after, we don't ask, is he a Wilsonian or not? We ask, how Wilsonian is he?
And I just talked to David M. Kennedy about Wilson. I know you listened to that episode.
Yeah. And so just stop and think for a moment that the most important orchestrator of the way Americans think about engaging the world for the 20th century should never have been president. And by the way, nobody knows this in 1912, but of course we know World War I is about to happen. So the man who is given the reins of whether or not the United States should engage the greatest war in global history and thereby redefine its position within the world itself is a man who I think should have still been governor of New Jersey, except Roosevelt couldn't let it go for 4 years.
Wilson, the first Democrat, first Southerner in a long, long time. Well, who knows what would have happened if Roosevelt was president and World War I breaks out in 1914. He had said that later on that he would have gone to war right away.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that Roosevelt would have gotten us into the war faster. And remember, Wilson wins re-election in 1916
on a slogan.
By the skin of his teeth.
On a slogan. He kept us out of war. Wow.
Yeah, so it takes something as dramatic as World War I to continue to upset the stable Republican lock. And once World War I is over, Republicans win the next 3 elections. It's only the Great Depression then, subsequently in 1932, that winds up breaking their lock. So that, I think, to my mind, reinforces just how unusual it was that any Democrat won at all during this period, certainly Wilson in 12 and 16.
So connect 1912 to 2024.
I think it's shaping up exactly the same way and with the exact same dynamic. Now, I'm hesitant to suggest that there is a lot to the comparison between Donald Trump and Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, let's say, was one of our most erudite and also most well-read and researched presidents in American history. All kinds of ways in which he's different from Donald Trump. But they do share an ego. And they do share a need to be the center of attention. And Donald Trump, as you and I are recording, has just announced his candidacy formally a few days ago.
This is a quest to save our country. Talking about saving our country.
He is going to run, worst kept secret in America, by the way. And I think that he is destined to split the Republican vote. And one of two things is going to happen.
Well, I'm sorry to interject. Do you think he's going to run as a third-party candidate if he doesn't get the nomination? Because you can't split a general election vote unless there's another candidate.
Well, so one of two things is going to happen. Either he wins the nomination. Maybe that's going to happen. I think it's less likely, but maybe that's going to happen. But at this point, Trump is remarkably unpopular with the general electorate. Trump's negative rating. Now, remember, there's a couple ways to evaluate a political leader. The approval rating for a president is usually the approval of how good a job they're doing. There's also a personal rating. Trump's personal rating, the negative, that is to say, I dislike more than I like this person, is well over 50% for the entire country. Most Republicans, who of course say that they will vote for Trump and back Trump, also say, and as the polling goes, they'd rather have somebody else with the same policies, that they are done with him and his erratic nature personally. They'd rather have a DeSantis. They'd rather have an Abbott. So if Trump wins the nomination, I think it's almost impossible to conceive of him actually winning re-election. And I'll give you a good example of a person who tried to run with negatives over 50%, and that was Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
It's just really hard to overcome the fact that people don't like you personally. But if he doesn't get the nomination, if DeSantis gets it, if Abbott gets it,
runs as a third-party person
on his own, or maybe he says, write my name in, or maybe he says to his people, this system is rigged, don't vote, which, by the way, is what he did in 2020 in Georgia for the special election for the Senate.
And he might not even have to tell them that, because a lot of people who were attracted to Trump weren't really involved in politics very much before that.
Yeah, and there's actually a complete acid test to this question, which is, I'd like everyone listening to our podcast right now, unless you're driving, to close your eyes and try to imagine the following scenario. And that is, imagine Donald Trump, him giving a concession speech and saying, I was beaten and I'm going to back the Republican nominee because I'm a good member of the party. I don't think there's anybody within the sound of our voices who can imagine that speech. It tells me if he doesn't win, he's either going to run or throw hand grenades the entire time.
Yeah, he'll claim that the GOP nominating process was rigged. Remember, the first election Donald Trump claimed was rigged was not the 2016 election against Clinton, which he won. He still said there were, millions of illegal immigrants who voted. It was the Iowa caucus. Yep. When Cruz won, he said that Cruz stole it from him. So, yeah, he could potentially just, like he's done with the 2020 election, say that the 2024 primaries were rigged. I mean, who knows?
And earlier in the campaign, in the primaries, when there were still 12, 13 people running, during one of the debates in particular, the candidates were asked, will you support the Republican nominee if it's not you? Only one candidate said no, and that was Donald Trump. Every other candidate, who, by the way, they were all lifelong Republicans and lifelong politicians, to be fair, said, of course, I'll support the nominee. I'm a good Republican. Trump said no, because if it's not me, it's not nearly as good, and it's probably rigged.
There are very few helpful or useful historical guides for this situation. I think your piece in Time magazine about, the headline is, the 2024 presidential election, Democrats have already won. And this is your piece in Time. That was the headline. You don't write the headlines, but that was or did you write that headline?
I think that actually was the title I suggested, to be honest.
Okay, so that's in Time. I want people to seek that out and read it, whether they agree with you or not. And your analogy was 1912. I think that does help us a little bit here, but number one, and this could be my final observation, everything we thought we knew about politics is out the door. Predicting the future has always been difficult, but especially now. Trump is trying to do something that hasn't been done in 100 years, and that's win a non-consecutive term. Biden is unpopular. Biden is old. I mean, the midterms turned out better than the Democrats expected, but his approval ratings, maybe the polls are all wrong too. So I just don't really know where we're going here.
Our track record for predictions in the last several years has not been good. But here's the dirty little secret about life. None of us know what's going to happen. And history, however imperfect, is the only guide we have. And it's not great, but it's the best one we got.
Well, Jeffrey Engel, as the host of this podcast, I would agree. Thank you once more for your time and insights. On the next episode of History as It Happens, some remarkable scenes are unfolding in China. People are protesting the government's COVID-0 policies, a government that brooks no opposition to its hold on power. We're going to discuss that next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.